She had thought the blindfolded German Shepherd was gone forever. 4 years had passed since the avalanche buried their mission, since she screamed his name into a storm that never answered back. But now, in the heart of Bear Creek's forest, tied and bleeding, she lifted her eyes, and there he was, Major. The dog who had once saved her life, scarred, older, and blind, but standing between her and the darkness once more. What happened next will break your heart and then put it back together with faith. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far the story of one loyal dog's courage can reach. The storm rolled across Bear Creek, Wyoming, with the kind of weight that pressed against the earth and made even the oldest pines bow as if they remembered storms past. Rain hammered down in sheets that blurred the narrow mountain highway into silver threads, and thunder growled low against the ridges. The town itself was small, tucked between valleys where smoke from wood stoves usually curled in peace. But this morning, the quiet was broken by the restless weather. Through the gray curtain of rain, a patrol cruiser moved with steady precision, its windshield wipers fighting to carve vision from the torrent. Behind the wheel sat Sheriff Rachel Monroe, 35 years old, her presence marked by the authority of her uniform. Rachel was tall, standing just above 5'8", with an athletic build forged through years of physical training. Her dark chestnut hair, often tied back into a neat low knot, clung damply to her cap as the humidity seeped through. Her pale green eyes reflected the stoicism of someone who had long ago learned to hold grief in silence, while her silver badge glinted faintly against the navy fabric of her shirt. Rachel had accepted the role of sheriff only months ago, after a long recovery from the nightmarish avalanche in Colorado that had fractured her life and stolen her closest companion, a German Shepherd K9 named Major. She wore her uniform not simply as duty but as armor, a visible promise to herself that she would not falter again. The storm rattled the cruiser windows as Rachel guided the vehicle past the last row of storefronts, a hardware store, a feed shop, and the old diner with its faded red awning, then out onto the gravel road that led into the Bear Creek Reserve. She was responding to reports of snares laid out along the North Trail, likely the work of poachers who had grown bolder with the passing seasons. As she drove, her mind was steady, but her chest carried that dull echo of loss, the way some scars never quite healed. She remembered the cold silence of the avalanche, the frantic calls that never reached the ears of the partner who had once been her lifeline. 3 days of searching had yielded nothing, and yet in her heart she had never let go. Now, as lightning flashed across the horizon, it was almost as if the mountain was reminding her of debts unpaid. The road narrowed and the cruiser rolled to a stop near the gated trailhead. Rachel stepped out into the storm, boots sinking into the soaked pine needles. The smell of wet earth and resin filled the air, sharp and alive. Adjusting her sheriff's rain jacket, she scanned the tree line. The forest here was dense, towering evergreens dripping with rainwater, shadows deepening between their trunks. She moved with cautious familiarity, one hand brushing the handle of her holstered sidearm, though she did not expect a human threat yet. Then, just at the edge of vision, something shifted. At first, it was no more than a blur against the trees, an outline that could have been a coyote or a trick of the storm. But as Rachel narrowed her gaze, the figure stepped forward. A dog, large and soaked to the bone, emerged slowly from the dripping pines. Its fur, once proud sable and tan, now matted into dark clumps against a lean frame. It limped, dragging one hind leg with a weakness that spoke of old injury. Rachel froze. She had seen hundreds of dogs in her career, but there was something unmistakable in the way this one held himself. His head was raised, ears twitching not in fear, but in recognition. Around his eyes, a white cloth was tied securely, obscuring sight entirely. A blindfold, weathered yet clean enough to show care, trailed slightly at the edges in the rain. And even without eyes to meet hers, the connection struck her like thunder itself. Her breath hitched as memories collided with the present. Slowly, she crouched into the mud, her hand instinctively resting near her holster, more from habit than fear. "Hey there, buddy," she murmured, her voice almost drowned by rain. "You lost?" The dog tilted his head, the cloth damp against his muzzle, ears twitching as though he remembered the rhythm of her voice. One of his ears bore a faint tear, and above the left brow, beneath the dripping fur was a scar, a pale, jagged line she knew as well as her own heartbeat. "Major," she whispered. For 4 years she had told herself it was impossible. For 4 years she had dreamed of the dog buried beneath snow. Yet here he was, older, thinner, blinded, but alive. She did the only thing that made sense. She sank fully to her knees in the mud, opened her arms, and let out a shaky breath. Major closed the distance with slow, deliberate steps, then pressed his head against her chest. He smelled of rain, earth, and old memories. But the weight of him was as real as it had ever been. Rachel held him tightly, her badge cold against his wet fur, tears mixing with the rain. For the first time in years, the silence inside her eased. "You remembered," she whispered. Major did not need sight to answer. His body leaned into her, shivering but resolute, as thunder rolled once more over the ridges of Bear Creek. Miles away, in a small wooden house on the far edge of Bear Creek, another figure stirred restlessly. 10-year-old Evan Parker sat upright in his narrow bed, sweat cooling on his brow, though the storm outside rattled the shutters. Evan was a thin boy, his frame small even for his age, with tousled light brown hair and blue eyes that carried both innocence and something older, like a secret he could not explain. He lived with his grandmother, Helen Parker, a retired Army nurse who carried herself with strictness but loved him fiercely. Helen was a woman in her mid-60s, slender but sturdy, with silver hair often tied into a bun and gray-blue eyes that had seen too much war and too many nights of waiting by radios for news that never came. She kept her household with quiet order, her manner sharp when she worried, but beneath it all was a reservoir of compassion that only Evan fully received. Evan's nights were often haunted by dreams, vivid images that felt too real to ignore. Tonight had been no different. He had seen a dog, large and noble, bound by ropes against a tree in the middle of a forest. Its eyes were hidden beneath a white cloth. In the dream, the storm raged, and the dog's body trembled as if waiting for someone who might never come. Evan jolted awake, chest tight with fear, clutching the worn sketchbook that rarely left his bedside. He flipped to a blank page, his small hands moving with urgency. The pencil scraped across paper, lines forming quickly into the outline of the dog he had just seen. The rain outside beat against the glass as he shaded the cloth across its eyes and the ropes that tied it. When he finished, the image stared back at him, uncanny in its detail. Evan exhaled shakily. He did not know why he drew these things, only that sometimes they came true in ways he could not explain. And tonight, the storm outside whispered that this dream was not just a dream. The morning after the storm broke clear, but left behind a damp heaviness that clung to Bear Creek like a secret. Mist drifted low over the ridges, and the forest floor glittered with beads of water clinging to pine needles. Sheriff Rachel Monroe stepped from her small office onto the wooden porch of the sheriff's department, her navy uniform crisp, badge polished, despite the fatigue under her pale green eyes. She had not slept much, not after holding Major through the night and confirming he was not a ghost. The townsfolk who saw her that morning greeted her with nods, some curious, some respectful. Rachel had noticed how eyes lingered on her uniform, how whispers followed when they realized she had a dog again. In Bear Creek, trust was not given easily, but the sight of the sheriff with a companion stirred something like hope. Major walked at her side, his paws steady on the wet ground, though his vision was gone. The white blindfold tied around his head fluttered slightly in the morning breeze. His coat was rough from years of surviving alone, his frame lean but powerful still, and his ears turned toward every sound. Despite his blindness, he held himself with quiet authority. Rachel felt his awareness as she clipped his leash to her belt, though she doubted she needed it. He seemed to follow her presence as if tethered by something deeper. Deputy Daniel Brooks emerged from inside the office with a thick folder of reports tucked under one arm. Daniel, nearing 60, was a man built like the trunk of an old oak, short, broad-shouldered, his silver hair cropped close, his lined face weathered from decades of patrol. His voice was low and gravelly, used sparingly, as though words were coins and he had learned to spend them wisely. He glanced at Major, raised one bushy brow, and gave a small grunt that might have been approval. "Snare reports came from 2 hikers yesterday," he said. "North Trail again, I'll come with you." Rachel nodded, grateful for his presence. They drove together in silence up the gravel road until the forest swallowed the town's sounds behind them. The trailhead was slick with rain, puddles gathered in shallow depressions. Rachel adjusted her belt, checked her sidearm, and led the way in. Major padded beside her, his ears twitching constantly. Several times he stopped, sniffed the air, then let out a low rumble deep in his chest. Rachel placed a hand gently against his shoulder. "Easy, boy," she whispered, though she took his warning seriously. A mile into the trail, Daniel spotted the first sign. A snare had been tied low between two saplings, the steel cables slick with rain. He bent down, studying the placement. "Close to the trail," he muttered. "They don't care who sees. Bold." Rachel crouched beside him. The trap was crude but effective, meant for deer or elk. Her eyes swept the ground, noting boot prints half erased by the storm. "They were here before the rain hit hard," she said. Daniel grunted again, his hand brushing the damp earth. "Organized," he replied. "Not just kids messing around." Major lowered his head, sniffing the snare. His ears twitched back, and his muscles stiffened. He turned sharply to the left, nose lifted toward a patch of dense undergrowth. Rachel followed his gesture, but saw nothing. The dog's low growl vibrated through her bones. She unclipped his leash, trusting him. He moved forward, steps deliberate, until he stopped at a tree whose bark had been recently gouged. Rachel touched the mark, rough, deliberate cuts, likely from someone testing a blade. Daniel straightened, scanning the canopy. "They're getting bolder," he said, "setting traps this close to town, not afraid of law." Back in town, Evan Parker sat at the wooden kitchen table of his grandmother's house, a stack of pencils scattered around him. His sketchbook lay open, pages already filled with scenes too vivid for a child's imagination. Evan was small, with tousled light brown hair and wide blue eyes that looked both curious and haunted. He wore a loose gray sweater with frayed cuffs, his legs swinging slightly above the floor as he worked. His hand moved quickly, tracing the outline of the same dog he had seen in his dream, tall, powerful, blindfolded in white. This time, he added a figure beside it, a woman in uniform, the badge on her chest roughly shaded but clear. The pencil trembled in his fingers, yet the image formed with uncanny clarity. Helen Parker, his grandmother, leaned over from the stove where she stirred oatmeal. At 65, Helen was slender but strong, her back still straight despite the years. Her hair was silver, tied neatly in a bun, and her gray-blue eyes carried both the discipline of a former Army nurse and the softness of a guardian who had raised Evan since his parents' absence. She glanced at the page and frowned. "That again?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. Evan bit his lip and nodded. "He's real, Grandma. I saw him." Helen set down the spoon, wiped her hands on a towel, and walked over. She studied the sketch, noting the details, the white cloth over the dog's eyes, the proud stance, the figure of a woman beside him. "And this woman?" she asked. "She's with him," Evan said simply. "She has to be." Helen sighed, her stern expression softening. She had long dismissed Evan's dreams as the fancies of a lonely boy, but his drawings unsettled her. Too often they carried truth. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dreams are just dreams, Evan, but sometimes—" Her voice trailed as if she did not want to finish the thought. She looked again at the picture, the badge, the dog. Something about it tugged at memory. She turned away briskly. "Eat your breakfast," she said, though her eyes lingered longer than before. In the forest, Rachel and Daniel pressed deeper. They found 2 more snares, each placed strategically near game, trails. The sense of violation gnawed at Rachel. She hated the idea of cruelty hidden among the trees. Major continued to sniff, ears flicking, body tense. Once he halted abruptly and barked, a sharp sound that echoed through the pines. Rachel raised her hand to signal Daniel. They waited, listening. The forest stilled, the only sound the drip of water from branches. After a long moment, Daniel spoke. "He smells something." Rachel knelt beside Major, running her hand over his damp fur. The white blindfold gave him an almost spectral presence, but his nose twitched with life. She trusted him in a way she had not trusted anyone for years. "We'll follow," she said. They traced his movements toward a clearing where the ground was trampled. Rachel crouched low, fingertips brushing the soil. Ash clung to her gloves. "Campfire," she muttered. "Recent." Daniel studied the remnants. "Poachers stayed the night. They're close." Rachel's chest tightened. She knew this was more than a minor nuisance. Whoever was operating in Bear Creek was confident enough to set camp within reach of the town. She stood, shoulders squared, rain still dripping from branches onto her uniform. "We'll need evidence," she said. Daniel nodded. "And back up. But for now, we watch." Major sat beside her, tail curled against the ground, his blind eyes hidden, but his ears alert. In his presence, Rachel felt steadier, less alone. The forest might be full of snares and shadows, but she was not walking it by herself anymore. The clouds had gathered again by late afternoon, heavy and bruised across the ridges of Bear Creek, though the rain had not yet returned. Sheriff Rachel Monroe walked the forest trail with her usual steady pace, the navy of her uniform dark against the dripping green pines, her silver badge catching the little light that filtered through, her boots pressed into the wet ground with measured crunches, her hand occasionally brushing the butt of her sidearm out of habit. At her side, padded Major, the blind German shepherd, his coat still rough from long nights of surviving the wild, the white blindfold around his eyes faintly stained from mud, but tied firmly. Though sightless, his ears twitched at every sound, and his steps matched hers as if he were reading the air around her. Rachel had insisted on walking the trail again after lunch, needing to map more of the poacher's territory. Deputy Daniel Brooks had argued she should wait for backup, but the stubborn streak that had carried her through grief would not let her. Daniel was back in town compiling reports, and Rachel had assured him she could handle a short round. Yet in her chest there was an unease, a heaviness that Major seemed to sense as he kept closer than usual, his body brushing against her leg with each step. The forest was quiet in the way that made the hair on her neck rise. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush. Rachel paused, scanning the tree line, her green eyes sharp, but saw only the sway of branches. She continued, forcing herself calm. The trail curved into a hollow where fallen logs and moss-covered boulders created natural blind spots. As she stepped forward, Major halted abruptly, ears pricked, a growl building low in his chest. Rachel turned, too late. Shadows moved from the undergrowth. Figures surged forward, men clad in camouflage jackets smeared with mud, faces half hidden beneath hoods. One raised a length of wood, and before Rachel could draw her weapon, the blow struck across her temple. Pain exploded white, and her knees buckled. She reached instinctively for her gun, but rough hands seized her wrists. Another man's voice snarled in a thick accent, words she did not catch. She twisted, fought, but dizziness overcame her. Through the blur she caught one last sight. Major, leaping at the attackers, teeth bared, the muscles of his lean body straining. He slammed into one man's arm, dragging him down, his growl reverberating through the hollow. Then darkness claimed her. In town, the school bell had rung long ago, and the chatter of children filled the classroom of Miss Clara Jennings, a woman in her early 40s with auburn hair pinned neatly, her brown skirt and cardigan worn but tidy. Clara was tall and graceful in movement, though her thin frame carried a weariness that came from years of raising 2 children alone after her husband's sudden passing. She was known for her kindness, though she demanded discipline in her classroom. Amongst the students sat Evan Parker, small and quiet in his desk, sketchbook open even though arithmetic problems filled the board. His tousled light brown hair fell into his wide blue eyes as his pencil scratched furiously. He was not drawing numbers. He was drawing a woman in uniform, bound with ropes, her head bowed, the silver badge on her chest still visible. Beside her he scribbled the figure of a large dog, blindfolded in white, lunging forward. His breathing quickened, chest rising with panic. Suddenly Evan cried out, the sound piercing the quiet room. His chair scraped back as he stood, clutching the sketchbook to his chest. The other children stared, some giggling nervously, others unsettled. Miss Jennings hurried to him, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "Evan, what is it?" she asked, her voice soft but urgent. "She's tied," he gasped. "She's in the forest. They hit her." His voice cracked, the certainty in his tone chilling for a child of 10. Clara glanced at his drawing, her brows knitting as she saw the detail, the uniform, the badge, the dog. She had seen Evan's strange pictures before, but never with this much intensity. "Evan, it's just a drawing," she said, though her voice betrayed uncertainty. He shook his head violently. "It's real!" Word reached Helen Parker within the hour. Helen arrived at the school in her worn gray cardigan, her hair in its familiar bun, her sharp eyes sweeping the classroom. Clara met her at the door, holding the sketchbook. "He drew this during lessons," she whispered, "and he shouted about someone being tied in the forest." Helen looked at the drawing, her heart tightening. The blindfolded dog, the woman in uniform. It was too close to what Evan had shown her before. Helen took Evan's hand firmly, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. "We're going to the sheriff's office," she said. Evan clutched her sleeve, still trembling. "She's in trouble, Grandma. I saw it." Deputy Daniel Brooks was bent over a map of Bear Creek when Helen burst into the office with Evan in tow. Daniel straightened, his lined face deepening with concern. "What's this?" he asked. Helen pushed the sketchbook toward him. Daniel studied the image of Rachel bound and the dog lunging forward. He looked at Evan, then at Helen. His jaw tightened. "Rachel went back out alone," he muttered. He grabbed his radio, trying to raise her. Only static answered. He slammed the receiver down, the first flash of anger breaking his usual calm. "She should have waited." Helen stood firm, her soldier's daughter steel showing. "You know as well as I do, Daniel, that boy sees things. We can waste time doubting, or we can move." Evan clung to her side, his blue eyes wide, still seeing what others could not. Daniel grabbed his coat and sidearm, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. He was not a man easily swayed by superstition, but he had seen enough of life to know when to trust instinct, and perhaps the strange visions of a child. He looked at Helen. "Stay here with him." Helen lifted her chin. "I'm not staying. Not if she's out there." Daniel sighed, the lines in his face deepening, then nodded curtly. He holstered his weapon, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped into the gathering twilight. Outside, the mist had begun to creep low again, and the forest waited, holding its breath. Far in the hollow, where Rachel lay bound, her consciousness flickered. The ropes bit into her wrists, the damp earth cold beneath her knees. Shadows moved around her, men speaking in harsh whispers. She forced her eyes open, catching glimpses of camouflage jackets and the glint of knives. Pain pulsed in her temple where the blow had landed, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to let them see fear. Somewhere nearby, she heard a bark, familiar, fierce, defiant. Major had not left her. The sound gave her strength, even as the darkness pressed close again. Night had settled over Bear Creek, heavy with returning rain. Thunder rolled low across the ridges as the forest sank into restless silence, broken only by the hiss of water through branches. Sheriff Rachel Monroe stirred awake on the damp earth, her body aching from the blow to her head, her wrists raw where ropes dug into her skin. Her navy uniform, once crisp with authority, was torn and streaked with mud, the silver badge at her chest dulled, but not broken. She lifted her head against the tree she had been tied to, pain flashing sharp in her temple, yet her pale green eyes burned with defiance. The poachers' voices drifted somewhere nearby, coarse and harsh, muttering in low tones. Rachel knew they would return soon. Her breath grew shallow as the cold sank into her bones. For a moment, despair crept in, but then the forest answered with the sound of paws padding on wet earth. From the shadows came a low growl, deep and thunderous, the sound of loyalty itself. Major had come back. The German shepherd emerged, his sable and tan fur slicked dark with rain. The white blindfold clung damp to his face, and his hind leg limped heavily after the scuffle, but his body carried undiminished purpose. He had not abandoned her. He pressed close, nose working the air until he found the ropes, his teeth gnashing against the soaked fibers. Rachel felt the pull, the strain, then the sudden snap as one strand gave way. Relief surged through her as blood returned to her hands, though it burned like fire. "Good boy," she whispered hoarsely, though Major did not pause. He tore at another rope until more fibers frayed, yet behind him the undergrowth stirred. One of the poachers had returned, his silhouette sharp against a flash of lightning. He cursed and raised a length of wood. Major growled, lunged once, then dodged as the man swung. Another figure shouted. There were too many, and Major, blind and weary, knew he could not hold them alone. With a sharp bark, he leapt back, vanishing into the rain before the men could strike again. Rachel's chest clenched, fear stabbing her, until she heard it. His call echoing through the pines, not of defeat, but of summons. Miles away, 4 other shapes lifted their heads from beneath a derelict shed on the edge of the forest. These were dogs that had wandered near town for months, strays who had learned to scavenge, to endure. Each bore marks of a hard life: a lean black Labrador with torn ears, a mottled hound with ribs visible under his coat, a golden retriever whose fur was matted but eyes still gentle, and a brindled shepherd mix with a scar across his flank. They were not trained, not disciplined, but when Major's bark reached them, something old stirred, a call of pack, a command born not of sight, but of memory and scent. Major returned to Rachel's side, his chest heaving, the 4 strays trailing behind him like shadows awakened. Their eyes flicked nervously in the rain, but they drew close, circling, around the bound woman. Rachel stared in disbelief, her lips parting as hope flared. "You brought them," she whispered. Major nosed the ropes again, then barked sharply to the others. The black Labrador, cautious but loyal, pressed forward, teeth worrying the strands until more fibers snapped. The hound pulled next, growling low. The ropes loosened, enough for Rachel to wrench her wrists free with a cry of pain. She collapsed forward, gasping, her arms trembling. Major pressed against her side, guiding her upright. The other dogs flanked them, forming a protective ring. In the distance, voices shouted in anger, the poachers realizing their captive was slipping away. One of the men crashed through the brush, only to be met with snarling teeth and lunges from the shepherd mix and the hound. They did not attack to kill, only to drive him back, their growls echoing like thunder. Rachel staggered to her feet, leaning heavily on Major. Though blind, he walked with steady purpose, nose raised, ears pricked, leading her along the faint trail his memory still held. The 4 strays followed, circling back whenever the men tried to advance. For every shadow of threat, a growl answered. For every flash of movement, a bark warned. The pack, ragged but resolute, moved as one under Major's command. Far away in town, Evan Parker sat at the kitchen table, his pencil racing across paper as though his hand no longer belonged to him. The storm rattled the windows, lightning flashing across his face. His sketchbook now showed not only the blindfolded dog, but a circle of 4 others, their bodies drawn rough but true. Beside them, he scrawled the figure of a woman in uniform breaking free of ropes. His blue eyes widened as his pencil flew faster. "He's not alone," he whispered. Helen Parker stood behind him, her face stern, but her breath quickening as she saw the details. Daniel Brooks, leaning over the table, scowled. "What do you mean?" he asked. Evan pointed to the page. "He called them. More dogs. They're with him now." Helen's gray-blue eyes narrowed as she looked at Daniel. "You've seen enough to know he's not making this up." Daniel exhaled heavily, then snatched his flashlight and sidearm. "Then we follow." The 3 pressed into the storm, Daniel leading with the determination of a man who had patrolled too many dark nights. Helen kept pace, her raincoat clinging to her slender frame, her hand gripping Evan's firmly. The boy clutched his sketchbook to his chest, pointing toward the forest with certainty. They moved through mud and shadows, the roar of the storm their constant companion. Then, as if the night itself confirmed it, the sound carried through the rain, a bark, fierce and sharp, followed by a chorus of growls. Helen froze, her heart hammering. Evan's eyes lit with recognition. "That's them," he whispered. Daniel raised his gun, scanning the trees, his jaw tightening. "We're close." Through the undergrowth, they broke into a clearing. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene. Rachel, battered but standing in her torn uniform, her badge glinting faintly under the storm. At her side was Major, head lifted, ears sharp despite the blindfold. Around them, the 4 strays circled, snarling at the shadows of retreating poachers. The image struck like a vision come to life. Evan gasped and clutched Helen's sleeve. "See? I told you," he said. Helen's eyes filled with both relief and awe, her steel softening as she whispered, "You were right. Daniel surged forward, calling Rachel's name, his gravel voice shaking with relief. The storm crashed overhead, the forest alive with sound, but louder still was the growl of loyalty that bound them all. Morning came to Bear Creek slow and heavy, the sky washed pale after a night of storms. Mist clung to the ridges and drifted between the pines, and the smell of wet earth carried through the town. Sheriff Rachel Monroe walked out from the forest's edge, her Navy uniform torn and darkened with mud and blood, her badge dulled, but still fastened firmly to her chest. Her green eyes were tired, yet unbroken, her posture upright, as if defiance alone held her together. At her side strode Major, his sable and tan coat matted from rain, the white blindfold tied firmly around his eyes. His limp was heavier now, but his body carried a quiet pride. Behind them padded the 4 strays who had answered Major's call, their ribs still visible, their eyes wary but watchful. Deputy Daniel Brooks was waiting at the trailhead with 2 state officers he had summoned in the night. Daniel's lined face hardened with relief as Rachel approached. "You're alive," he muttered, his gravel voice rougher than usual. Rachel managed a nod, then pulled something from beneath her jacket, a small pouch taken from the poacher's abandoned camp. Inside were lengths of steel snare wire, a rusted knife stained with animal blood, and a torn strip of camouflage cloth soaked in motor oil. She held it up. "They left this behind. Their campfire was still warm when we pulled out." Daniel examined the items, his weathered hands steady. "That's enough to start," he said, passing them to the officers. One of them, Officer Rachel Nguyen, a woman in her late 30s with sharp cheekbones and steady dark eyes, inspected the cloth. She wore tactical green with a badge at her shoulder, her black hair tied tightly at the nape of her neck. Known for her meticulous attention to detail, she had built her reputation on tracking illegal logging crews across the state. She sniffed the oily fabric, frowning. "Unfiltered transmission fluid," she said. "Only leaks from older pickups, late 1990s models. That narrows our suspects considerably." Rachel added more. She described the voices she had heard while tied to the tree, the accents rough, their words half-whispered but filled with anger. She pointed out the direction they had fled when Major and the strays forced them back. Daniel unfolded his map, circling the area around Brush Creek. "That's where they'll hole up," he said. Within 2 days, the trail was followed. Officers found the makeshift camp, hidden near Moose Ridge Logging Road. Burned ash still clung to the ground, littered with animal bones. Snare wire coils were stacked in a crate. Most damning was the truck parked under a tarp, an old gray pickup, its rear axle dripping the same fluid that stained the cloth Rachel had brought back. The men inside were caught unprepared. 4 of them, lean and hardened from years of poaching, tried to scatter, but the officers moved swiftly. One brandished a crowbar, another a knife, but none escaped. Evidence piled. Quickly, Rachel's ropes with her blood still on the fibers, the weapons, the truck, and even ledger books recording sales of animal pelts. The law came down hard, and for the first time in months, Bear Creek's woods breathed easier. When news reached town, Bear Creek gathered in the square. Farmers, shopkeepers, children, and the elderly crowded together under strings of bunting. The sheriff's office erected a platform. At the center stood Rachel, her uniform repaired, but still bearing the scars of that night, her badge polished until it caught the morning sun. Major sat beside her, the blindfold fresh and white, his ears alert. Behind them, the 4 strays rested in the shade, their eyes softening under the watchful kindness of children sneaking them scraps. Mayor Thomas Reed, a man with thinning gray hair and a genial round face that had long presided over town barbecues and fundraisers, spoke first. "Our sheriff has stood for us not with words alone, but with courage," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. And she was not alone. A dog once left for dead remembered his duty. A boy's drawings warned us. And together, they brought justice where fear had tried to take hold. Applause rose, rippling across the square. Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm but strong. "The poachers will not haunt these woods again. Their greed is ended by the evidence we carried out. Snares, blood, even their truck dripping oil as if it wanted to betray them. But this was never just about catching criminals. This was about loyalty, about a bond that even blindness cannot break. Major is more than a survivor. He is proof that service can endure when everything else falls away. That is why today I announce the rebuilding of the Bear Creek K-9 unit, and Major will be its first partner, its symbol, its teacher for the next generation. The crowd erupted in cheers, the sound echoing across the valley. Helen Parker stood near the front, her gray-blue eyes softened with pride. Beside her, young Evan clutched his sketchbook. With Helen's urging, he stepped forward, shy but determined. Rachel knelt to meet him. He opened to the page he had finished. A drawing of a woman in uniform beneath the towering pines, standing tall beside a blindfolded dog. At the bottom, he had written carefully, "Kindness echoes louder than fear." Rachel's throat tightened as she touched the boy's shoulder. "You've given us all a reminder," she said. Evan's blue eyes shone with new confidence. The fear that had once haunted him eased by being heard. The townspeople clapped, not only for Rachel, but for the boy who had bridged dreams and reality. The 4 strays, once nameless wanderers, were taken in by townsfolk after the ceremony. The black Labrador went home with a farmer's family who promised him fields to roam. The hound found a place with the school custodian who appreciated his loyalty. The golden retriever became a companion to a widowed woman who smiled for the first time in months. And the brindled shepherd mix, scarred but strong, was adopted by the fire chief, who said simply, "He's earned it." Weeks later, Rachel sat on the sheriff's porch at dusk, Major lying at her feet. The bruises on her face had faded, the stitches at her temple healed. She watched the town move quietly, neighbors greeting one another, children running past with laughter. Major lifted his head, ears twitching, though his eyes would never see. He didn't need them. He had his place, his family, his home again. And Evan, sitting in the classroom with Miss Jennings watching proudly, no longer hid his sketches. His art became the centerpiece of the school, the drawings of dogs and people standing together pinned to the wall. For him, visions had become more than a burden. They had become a gift, a bridge that carried hope. For Rachel, for Major, for Evan, and for Bear Creek. The echoes of that night would not fade into fear, but rise into memory. They were proof that kindness outlasts cruelty, that courage can grow from scars, and that even a blind dog can lead the way home. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come with thunder or fire. They come in quiet forms, in a blind dog who still remembers loyalty, in a child whose drawings echo the truth, and in a community that chooses to believe again. It reminds us that God works through unexpected messengers, and that even in the darkest forests of our lives, He sends us light to find the way home. In our everyday lives, we may not face poachers in the pines, but we all face struggles that threaten to bind us. The lesson of Rachel and Major is that loyalty, kindness, and faith that can cut through any rope of fear. When we open our hearts to love, we become part of God's quiet miracles. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story means to you. Write amen if you believe that kindness echoes louder than fear. Do not forget to subscribe so that more stories of courage and faith can reach hearts around the world. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your days with the quiet miracles that remind us He is always near.